All right, if we could start with a prayer, please. Dear God, please help me to set aside everything I think I know about this program, about our big book, about our meetings, about the steps, and most importantly about you, God, so that I might have an open mind and a new experience. Help me to see truth. Amen. Amen. I'll lower this a little bit. I'm really short. So, this is a big meeting. Well, my name is Benjamin Berry. I'm a recovered alcoholic. Let me move this so my big book doesn't fall on me. I really appreciate Mackenzie asking me to come out here, and this has been quite literally one of the friendliest groups I've had the privilege of going to. I mean, just everyone coming up and introducing themselves and saying hello. I mean, it really, you can feel the spirit of AA in this room, and the spirit of service, and the spirit of that thing that I fell in love with when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, that even if I don't know you, even if I've never seen you or met you before in my life, that we know each other anyways. That there's some sort of connection. I could feel that in this room, so I really appreciate you all's hospitality and everything. What I wanted to start off with is a little disclaimer that I usually give when I talk. There was a speaker that I really loved listening to. He passed away a few years ago, but he was a preacher as well as an AA member. And he talked about how when he got up from the pulpit or the podium, his goal was to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comforted. And to a great extent, that's kind of what I'm here to do as well. Because and we laugh and we joke, and by the end of this, there's going to be some of you that really are on point with what I'm saying. The real alcoholic, the one that maybe you've been coming in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for years, and you can't stay sober. Or maybe you've been in Alcoholics Anonymous sober for years, but you're not happy. And for you, I want to offer this solution that comes from our big book that says there is hope. And that we don't have to be sober and miserable. And we don't have to be the chronic slipper who just can't get, I just can't get it. That doesn't have to be the case. On the other hand, there's a group of people, and every group I talk at, I don't care how friendly or how wonderful it is, there's always that group of people that were raised in a certain way in Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's certain things that I was taught that I repeat like a parrot, even though upon closer examination there's really no depth and weight to it, like our big book says. When I got sober in 2010, the message that was presented to me in Alcoholics Anonymous was just don't drink, go to meetings, and you're a winner. And it sounded really, really good, and I would repeat that ad nauseum. And then at a year and a half sober, I'm living at my grandmother's house rent-free. I can't make a living. I'm stealing from her purse in the middle of the night, not to go get liquor, but just because I want to steal something. I'm a compulsive liar, and all these things. But I'm not drinking. I'm going to a lot of meetings, and supposedly I'm a winner, which was not the truth. I wasn't a winner. I was a poor example of what an AA is. I was a poor example of what a human being is. See, what happened was I got sober and I just didn't drink, and I went to meetings, but I didn't apply any sort of spiritual principles to my life. And the big book tells me that if I'm an alcoholic of our type, someone who's lost the power of choice and drink, that I have to live on a spiritual basis of life. And I didn't have that at a year and a half sober. And so I'm sitting in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous dying of untreated alcoholism, sober. I'm going to meetings, I'm not drinking, but every single day I wake up and I think, gosh, it's just another one of those days. And throughout my day I'm thinking about different ways that I can take my own life. And we've seen this recently in Louisville, at least. I don't know if it's the same case in Bardstown. It's really across the country, and the guys that I've talked to, that guys with multiple years, guys and gals with multiple years sober, 15, 20, 30 years, are taking their own lives sober. And I have to wonder, we had a guy in Louisville that had 50 some odd years of sobriety and took his own life after taking his wife's life. I don't know what was going on in that gentleman's life, but I know for me, where I was at a year and a half sober, is I didn't know how to live. I knew that drinking didn't work. I tried it. And my life was miserable. But at the same token, I'm here going to meetings, and I'm trying to do this thing called Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm still miserable. So I'm between a rock and a hard place, and I don't know what to do with my life. What happened was that about a year and a half, 2 years sober, a group of men came into my life that I lovingly use the term big book thumper, and that's what they were. They were grounded in our basic text. They worked the 12 steps. They lived the spiritual principles that were outlined in our basic text. And they were active. They were active home group members. They were active 12-steppers. They were active sponsors. They were doing the deal. And these guys came to me and they said, Benjamin, what's going on? And I said, I don't know what's going on. I'm a year and a half sober and I want to kill myself. I don't know what's going on. I'm not happy. And they said, well, Benjamin, have you ever worked the 12 steps? And I said, well, in my own way I have, which if a newcomer gives you that means they haven't worked the 12 steps. But that was my answer. It's like, yeah, I've worked the steps in my own. There's not your own way in this deal. And one of the lines that really irks people, but it's not my quote, it's Dr. Bob's. Dr. Bob said there's no such thing as a personal interpretation of the 12 steps. Why is that? Because we have our big book. That is the interpretation of how, when, and with whom to work the 12 steps. I don't need any personal interpretation. I don't need opinions. I don't need what I heard in a meeting one day. Because there's a lot of things that we hear in meetings that just aren't AA. They're not bad intrinsically. It's not bad stuff. But a lot of times as a newcomer, I thought that AA was this, because I heard it in a meeting. And AA has nothing to do with that. And so coming up here to speak, what I'm going to be sharing is my experience with the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm going to try my best to not share my opinions, to not share my personal interpretations, to not share what I think or what my sponsor told me or this or that or what I heard in a meeting, but to share what my experience is from our basic text. The clear-cut, precise, definite, specific directions from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so that's what I'm going to attempt to share today. When I got sober, I was 19 years old. And I got into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I didn't really know what an alcoholic was. I called myself an alcoholic for, a long while because that's what everyone was doing. I guess I'm an alcoholic. Alcoholism ran in my family. Even though I was adopted, it was there in my adoptive family. I'm the 5th member of my family to be in AA. But I didn't know what alcoholism was. And when we read A Vision for You, that's the same case with Dr. Bob. It said he realized that he was somehow abnormal, but he didn't fully know what it meant to be an alcoholic, and that was my case. What I thought alcoholism was what I heard in meetings. And so I'm a newcomer. I'm going to an AA meeting, and they ask the question that's asked at almost every discussion meeting. Are there any newcomers to AA? And I'd raise my hand. My name's Benjamin. I'm an alcoholic. And they say, perfect. We have a newcomer. Let's talk about the first step. Great topic for a newcomer. What would happen, though, after that topic was introduced is the first guy would share it, and he'd say, the first step. Let me tell you about the first step. When I got sober, I had a DUI, and I'd gone to jail 3 times, and it was awful, and that was my first step, realizing that. And then the next guy to share would say, that's nothing. When I got sober, I had 4 DUIs, and I'd been to jail 5 times. And then the next guy would say, that's nothing. I've had 6 DUIs, I've been to prison, and it's just this big pissing contest, essentially, of who has the bigger war story, who has the worst drunk log. And by the time we get around the circle, we have a serial killer rapist that has 10 DUIs and has been to prison 3 times. And I, as a 19-year-old kid, couldn't relate to that. And what I see happen over and over again, we wonder today, Alcoholics Anonymous, the worst cases when it comes to success that we have in Alcoholics Anonymous today, 2 groups of people, young people and women. And we wonder why, because we share these war stories, we share these drunkalogs, and we try to one-up each other, and we push the women and the young people right out of the rooms. Because they can't. I, as a 19-year-old, had never been to prison, had never gotten divorced, had never gotten a DUI, had never wrecked a car. I couldn't relate. And so I'm sitting in the meetings, and we're talking about the first step, and I think this is the first step, and I can't relate. So I can't work the first step. I'm not really an alcoholic because I haven't done those things. And so what it took for me was a sponsor that sat me down, and they opened up the big book to page 44. And he asked me, "What do you think you're an alcoholic?" And I said, "I don't really know." He said, "Well, why don't you know if you're an alcoholic?" I said, "Because I can't relate in the meetings." And he said, "Well, that has nothing to do with alcoholism. Ideally, it should. That's what we should be talking about in meetings. But a lot of times we don't. We get into this open discussion hell, and all we want to talk about is the war stories." And so what he said was, there's 2 qualifiers for being an alcoholic. And he took me to page 44. And he said, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic. And he said, can you relate with those two statements? Well, if when I honestly want to, I find I can't quit entirely, sure. There were many times that I got drunk, and for some reason when I got drunk, I would call my mother. Poor woman. Poor woman. I'm 17, 18 years old. I'm living in Detroit doing sales. She's down here in Louisville, and I'm calling her drunk. And I'm garbling my words and cussing at her. It was just a terrible thing that a son should never do to their mother. And I'd wake up the next morning and I'd see all these calls that I made to my mother, and I'd be like, oh my God, I really did not want to do that. And I'd say to myself, obviously it was the drinking. I wouldn't have done that if I wasn't in a blackout or I wasn't, wasted. So I don't want to do that anymore. Maybe it was I was in a relationship and I ruined the relationship because my drinking got in the way. Maybe it started to interfere with work. And there were so many of these times that I would say to myself, I'm done drinking. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm done for good. And I meant it. I meant it with every fiber of my being. One of the sickest things that I hear in meetings today, and you all can probably relate with this because it seems to happen pretty much everywhere that I've been, is that we have a newcomer come into our rooms. And we watch him come in the door. And he sits in the very back corner. And week after week he comes here. No one reaches their hand out to him. No one pulls him aside and says, hey buddy, do you have a sponsor? You work in the 12 steps? How can we help you get into this deal? We just watch him. And then one week, inevitably, he's gone. And then we here, who are left in the meeting, we have the nerve to say something like, well, he just didn't want it. He just didn't want it. And the truth of my experience in drinking is there were many times that I wanted to stop. And the big book tells me that the most powerful desire to stop is of absolutely no avail. It's not a matter, people die of alcoholism who wanted this thing desperately. There are newcomers who come to AA and the meetings that they go to are so void of a solution. So we have meetings here in Kentucky that have voted God out. The group conscience, they decide we're talking about God too much in our meetings. Let's vote it out. And we vote out the one solution that AA offers. We have meetings. I've got a friend down in Dallas. We've got meetings down there that if you go into a meeting with your big book, they've got bouncers up front that are going to tell you to take that book back to your car. We're not going to talk about that here. We don't want that. We've got meetings that are charging money to newcomers to hear fifth steps. I mean, it's just really sick stuff. And we wonder why newcomers can't get sober. It's because they don't want it. Not the truth. Not my experience. Not the experience of hundreds of newcomers that I've talked to. There are plenty of people that want this thing desperately. But for one reason or another, they weren't offered the solution. Oftentimes, they weren't able to get this thing. And so for me, my experience with this thing and not being able to stop, the loss of choice that we talk about, this mental obsession, it was throughout my drinking. There were so many times I wanted desperately to stop, but I couldn't. Something, after a week or so, a month, a few days, a few hours maybe, something would get into my head and I'm sober. And a few hours pass and I'm sober. And a few days pass, and I'm still sober. And then that restless, irritable, and discontentedness comes up, which those aren't words, if you're new, those aren't words that I would use when I was drinking. What I would explain it as is, gosh, it's just a bad day. It's just a really bad day. I need to relax. I need to wind down. This is just not, things aren't going so well. And that strange mental blank spot would hit. And suddenly I'm off to the stupid races again. The second part says, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take. And I was the guy, when I went to a party, everyone was drinking. Oftentimes everyone was getting drunk. But there came a point in the time during that night that everyone would stop drinking. And they'd go into the living room and they'd watch TV, or they'd have conversation, or they'd listen to music or play video games or something. And I wanted to be there with them. But something in me, this phenomenon of craving, this loss of control that I have when it comes to my drinking, something's motivating me. I want to be in there with them in the living room. But what I'm doing is I'm standing in the kitchen looking through cups and bottles trying to find just a little bit more because I'm not done. And so that's what alcoholism is. It's the loss of choice and the loss of control. And when it was presented to me like that, being 19 years old, despite the war stories, despite the drunk logs, I was able to relate with that. And my experience is that the book says over and over again that if you're a real alcoholic, this is what you can identify with. Put aside the DUIs and the wrecked marriages and the wrecked cars. Can you relate with this loss of choice control? And I could. I could. And I certainly had those other consequences. I don't want to stand up here and say I was a drinker that I got into quite a bit of trouble. But when I'm in a meeting, I'm naturally trying to find the differences. When I'm a newcomer, I'm naturally trying to find what will separate me. Because ultimately, I don't want to be an alcoholic, because that's going to entail a lot. And so as a newcomer, I'm always trying to find these differences, and I would use the war stories and the drunkalogs as ways to differentiate myself from you. That's the first part of the first step. The second part is real simple. The book talks about on pages 60 through 61 this idea. He gives us an analogy that I'm like an actor trying to run the whole show. And as a kid, I could really relate to this part, because as a kid, I did theater in high school. And I remember there was a play that I did. I was like 13 or 14 years old, and it was The Hobbit. And I was assigned the Great Goblin character. And it really didn't mean much. I mean, I was on stage like 5 minutes out of the whole hour-and-a-half play. I had maybe 3 lines. It was really a small, insignificant role. But after like 2 weeks of rehearsal, I'm going to the director and I'm saying, hey, it would be really cool if we had a sword fight. And I'd be happy to choreograph it for you. And the music that we're listening to for this whole play, it's not working with me. They were playing The Who, and I've come to like The Who now, but I was 13 years old. That's what my dad listened to, you know. I don't know about this music. And the dwarves, they don't know what the hell they're doing. They're running around. They can't memorize their lines. I could do this play much better than they could. And if you just let me fix things, then everything will be okay. Everyone will be happy, including myself. And that's the story of my life, is that I'm going around thinking that if you will only do as I wish, if things would only turn out the way I want them to, then I would be happy. The big book talks about 2 delusions. The word delusion is used twice. The first one refers to the first part of the first step. The delusion that I'm like other people, or presently may be, has to be smashed. I am bodily and mentally different. That delusion it's just that. It's a delusion. The second delusion it talks about on page 61, it says, is he not under the delusion? Am I not under the delusion that I can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if I only manage well? And that's the delusion that I'm under. Everything will be okay. I'll stop drinking. Everyone will be happy if my family would just get off my back. If the job would just give me the promotion. If the police would just leave me alone. If whatever, fill in the blank. If things would just go the way I want them to do, then everything will be okay. And this is the spiritual malady, because ultimately, why am I doing this? Because I have no direction. I have no guidance. I have no director. I'm trying to play the director. And this is the state of my spiritual malady. The big book says that when we can treat this spiritual malady, when the spiritual malady is overcome, that we straighten out physically and mentally. You see, when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous, I thought that we were going to tackle alcoholism. I thought that we were going to deal with how could I not want to drink anymore? How could I control the way I drink? How could I? But what the weird thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is that they told me, we're not even going to deal with that. We're not going to deal with your drinking. What we're going to deal with is this disconnect that you have, this lack of direction, this lack of guidance, and that lack of power is your dilemma. And that the main object of this book is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, period. And once that is established, once I get this conscious contact with a power greater than me, then the alcoholism fixes itself. That the obsession is removed, and I no longer crave alcohol because I'm no longer drinking. It's kind of counterintuitive. I think I'm going to deal with my drinking, but what I'm here to deal with is really this disconnect that I have with this thing called God. It's funny, I was listening to a speaker the other night, and he was talking about how there was a time in Alcoholics Anonymous where people like me couldn't have got sober. 19 years old, just didn't get sober. There was a time that if you came into Alcoholics Anonymous and you still had a watch, or you still had a suit, or you still had a job, or a car, or a wife, you wouldn't get sober because you hadn't lost enough. And today, it's really beautiful. I was talking to some young guys here, and I see a lot of young guys in Louisville, including myself, getting sober. That's not the case anymore. We're seeing younger and younger people getting sober. But I do say, and the speaker was talking about, there is one thing that has to be lost before coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. There's one thing that I have to lose in order to get sober and to stay sober. And the crazy thing about this is that this one thing that I have to lose, a millionaire with Corvettes, with women galore, with money out the wazoo, he can lose this. But at the same time, an alcoholic who's sleeping under a bridge abutment, who cannot stop drinking, who's homeless and living in the same clothes that he's been living in for a year. This person may not lose this thing. And it's necessary that I have to lose this to get sober. So the question is, what is that? What I have to lose in order to get and stay sober is the idea that I can do the job myself. That I know what's best. That I can manage. That I can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if I manage well. And until I lose that, there's no hope in my recovery. I can get sober for a time. I could get sober when I was drinking. The problem wasn't getting sober. The problem was staying sober. And what would happen is I'd get sober, and then my management mode would come back in. And suddenly I'm arranging what I need to do, what I think I need to do. And I see this all the time with newcomers. Is we get a brand new guy coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, and you see him in detox, and he's just beaten up. And he is willing as all get out, and he says, I'm willing to do anything. I'll do whatever you want me to do. Just please tell me what I need to do to get sober. And then 28 days later, after he spent a little bit of time in rehab, that little desperate newcomer is now turned into the most arrogant pissant that you'll ever meet. I don't know. I don't need to do what you all need to do. I know better. And then that guy will not stay sober. And we see it over and over again, that if I still think that I can do the job myself, that I know what's best, I'm not going to get sober. And so this is the first step. I'm powerless. I'm screwed. I am living in a disease that is a vicious circle. When I want to stop, I find that I'm not able to, and so that I start drinking again. I'm trapped in this cycle of the phenomenon of craving. I drink and I get into the consequences. I do things that I don't want to do, and then I tell myself I'm going to stop, and I try to stop, and I'm not able, and it's a vicious circle, and it rolls me right into a homeless shelter, right into rehab, right into prison, right into the morgue. Or maybe right into your home, your comfortable, nice $1 million home, drinking yourself to death, whatever it may be. But this is the hopelessness of alcoholism as this book describes. And then the second part is that my way, my plans, my designs don't work. And if I can get with that first step, then the second step's pretty easy. The big book asks me one question in the chapter We Agnostics. It says, do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe that there's a power greater than me? And I had lots of objections to God. I had bad experiences with religion. Most of us do. But the question is not, what's your view on religion? The question's not, what was your religious past? The question's not any of this. It's, do you now believe, or are you even willing to believe? And if I've connected with the first step, then I'm going to say, yes, I hope to God there's something bigger than me. Step 2 is done. Step 3 then is a decision. We look at the steps, and step 1 is the problem. Step 2, being God, is the solution. And so step 3 is simply me making a decision that I want to live in the solution. I want to embrace this solution. The problem is I'm not able to snap my fingers and go from problem to solution. I'm not capable of doing it. If I did, I would have done it long before. And so what we start with is step 3. It's a decision. I'm making a commitment that I want to live in this solution, which is God. And going along with that, all the things in Alcoholics Anonymous that give me access to God. The steps, the meetings, sponsorship, 12-step work, all this sort of stuff. I'm making a commitment that I want to live in this thing. And so in step 3, I pray that third step prayer and I make that decision. But the problem is that's not enough. It's a decision. I have to move further, the big book says, and so it takes action. I'm making a decision to turn my will and my life over, but I really don't know what my will and my life is. I know in a general way, and so what we do now is we do an inventory. And I'm able to look at how resentment has played a role in my life. I'm able to see how pretty much if you've come in contact with me and didn't do what I wanted you to do, that I have a resentment against you. And that was a long list for me. I'm able to see how fear has played a role in my life. That pretty much everything is fueled by fear. The biggest one for me is the fear of not getting your all's approval. I want your approval. I want my family's approval. I want so-and-so's approval. I mean, this fear drives me. It dictates what I wear. It dictates what I drive. It dictates where I live. I mean, all this fear is a driving force. It's an evil and corroding thread, the big book says. And the fabric of my existence has been shot through with it. And then I look at my relationships, my sex conduct, and I see how this self-centeredness, this selfishness has driven all of my relationships. I used to think I was a people pleaser. I'm not a people pleaser. The only reason I wanted to people please was because it made me feel good. It gave me a level of satisfaction. That's not people pleasing. That's being self-centered. And so I see how all of these things, this delusion that I'm under, that I'm just trying to fix things, I'm just trying to help you, I'm just trying to help me, was a delusion. At the root of all of this, at the root of my spiritual malady, is this innate spiritual sickness called self-centeredness. And while, as long as that's there driving me, it talks about how that we're examples, extreme examples of self-will run riot. But here's the kicker, but he usually doesn't think so. When I'm in self-will mode, I don't think that I'm in self-will mode. I think I'm just trying to fix things. I think I just know what's best and just get out of my way or help me, one or the other, and we'll get things taken care of. And so in the inventory, I'm able to see the truth behind these things, to an extent. But the big book tells me that we usually find a solitary self-appraisal insufficient. And that was my experience. I can't just write an inventory and see the 100% truth. I'm not able to do that. And so what I needed to do was in our fifth step, I needed to sit down with my sponsor, a third party who's not emotionally tied with this stuff in my inventory, to see the truth, to find the exact nature of my wrongs. And there was a lot of fear behind that, because there were a lot of things that I did that I didn't want to share with my sponsor. And it's amazing, because now being a sponsor, I've heard probably 60 or 70 fifth steps, and it's funny how when I dropped my first fifth step, I thought I was so unique. I thought I was so special that the things I had done, thought, said, had never been done before. And then after you hear a few fifth steps, you start to see that we're really not original. There's only so many ways to screw. There's only so many ways, to rob someone. And we hear the same things. And so what we find over time is that I'm not alone. And that the motive, and that while the action may not have been the same, the character defects that are fueling me have been the same in all of us. And so in the fifth step, primarily, I was able to see in a clearer way my character defects. But on a secondary note, I was able to see that I wasn't alone in this deal. In step 6 and 7, I'm turning these character defects over. And in step 6, it says we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And a lot of times I'll just kind of gloss over this thing. Oh yeah, I'm ready. But if I really get honest about it, it's like procrastination, laziness, sloth, all these things, justified anger. Am I really ready to let these things go? No, I don't feel ready to let these things go. So what the big book instructs me to do on page 74 is that I look back at the first 5 proposals, the first 5 steps, and I ask myself, have I done these steps honestly and thoroughly? When I was, last summer I went to Cedar Point, up in Cleveland area, and it's an amusement park if you've never heard of it or been there. And I'm such a little girl, I'd never ridden a roller coaster before in my life, but I made a commitment, this time I'm going to ride a roller coaster. And what did I do? I stood in line, I went through the gate opened, I sat down in the chair, I put the seatbelt on me, I put the bar over me, and the guy came to check to make sure my big rear end isn't going to slide off the thing, He gave the thumbs up, the green light came up, and I'm going up the hill. If you had asked me, Benjamin, at the top of that hill, are you ready to go over this roller coaster? I would have said, no, I don't feel ready at all. I feel like I'm ready to poop myself, I don't feel ready. But was I in fact ready? Yes. Why? Because I had taken the actions necessary to get ready. I stood in line, I went through the gate, I got buckled in, I had the bar come down, the guy checked it, he gave the thumbs up, and the green light came on, I was up the hill. And the same thing is with step 6, is I don't feel ready to have God remove these defects of character. But if I look at the first 5 steps and I have been honest and thorough with them, then I am in fact ready to have God remove these defects of character. And so in step 7, then what I'm doing is I'm asking God to remove them. It's like signing a consent form. If any of y'all have been to the hospital and had to have surgery, what's the doctor going to do? He's going to diagnose you. He's going to give you a treatment plan. This is the problem. This is what we need to do. And he gives you a piece of paper. It's a consent form. And he says, do you consent to having these things done? And I sign my name, and then he goes and does the work that he needs to do. That's what I'm doing in step 7. I've already established the problem. I'm powerless over alcohol. My life's unmanageable. I've been living off character defects, primarily self-centeredness. I know what the actions are going to be because I can read the next few steps. I know I'm going to have to make amends. I know I'm going to have to continue to take inventory. I know I'm going to have to help others and pray and meditate. And so in step 7, what I'm doing is I'm signing the consent form. God, please take these character defects. And that's all step 7 is. And just like in surgery, after I sign that consent form, I do not have the right to tell the doctor what to do. he does what he's good at doing. Same thing as in step 7 is when I sign this consent form turning my life, my will, my character defects over to a power greater than me, I no longer have the right to dictate to God when, how, where he's going to remove these things. That's up to him. All I need to do, the whole steps are designed that I have this problem. When I first come in, it's my alcoholism. And then I apply the steps to other areas of my life, my home, my occupations, my affairs. I've got this problem, and my natural inclination is I want to take care of it. And the whole step process then is to pry one finger after another off of the problem, direct my attention to God and to working with another alcoholic. And then when I turn around one day, I look back at that problem and it was taken care of. It was taken care of by God. The third step promise that God will provide what I need if I keep close to him and perform his work well. I wouldn't have believed that coming in. I've got all of these issues going on. And you all tell me just work the 12 steps. And I look at the 12 steps and I'm like, there's nothing about a PO. There's nothing about getting an apartment. There's nothing about getting a job. How on earth is this going to fix it? They say just work the steps. God will take care of those things. You work the 12 steps. And the miracle of this deal is that what seemed at first as a flimsy reed, it didn't look like AA was going to work, has proven to be the loving and powerful hand of God. That when I turn my attention to who I can be of service to, I look back and the problem's been removed. And it wasn't removed by me. It was removed by a power greater than me. And so in 8 and 9, what I'm doing now is I'm going out to my fellows and I'm going to make right the damage that I've done. And the question naturally comes up with a newcomer, why do I have to do this? Isn't it good enough that I'm sober? Can't I make living amends and just be a good person from now on? Why do I have to go back and make these things right? Why do I have to dig up this stuff that's been long buried? The example I always give is if I went to Mackenzie, and do you have any kids? Okay. Daughter? Son. Okay. I'm afraid whenever I use this example, I'm going to get punched one day, so I'm going to make this real. If I were to go up to your son and punch him in the face, you and I could not be friends anymore, correct? No. He'd probably kill me is what would happen. And that makes sense to me, that if I hurt someone you love, you and I can't have a relationship anymore. The problem is what I've been doing is I've been going through my life, I've been hurting, harming, and hating some of God's children, thinking that I can still have a relationship with God. And for one reason or another, I can't explain it. I can't. If I'm still bearing hatred towards someone, if I'm still harming the people about me, my relationship with God is in the toilet. And so in 8 and 9, what I have to do, primarily to get this relationship with God, is I need to go back and clean up the past. Going back to the actor analogy, I'm in this play, I've been running the show, I've been stepping on everyone's toes. In order for me to resume a vital place in this play, wouldn't it be necessary that I have to go back and talk to my fellow actors? It's not going to be a very good play if I'm constantly at odds with my fellow actors and the stage people and the soundtrack artists. It just doesn't work. And certainly I couldn't have a relationship with my director, with my God, with my higher power, if I don't repair the damages that I've done to some of his kids. And so that's what I'm doing in 8 and 9. In step 10, what I'm called to do is to continue. To continue. And one of my mentors said that's the most important word in the whole big book is continue. And so the directions, the marching orders for this is that I continue to watch for my character defects, selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. When these crop up, I go back to steps 1, 2, and 3, and I ask God to remove them, take the power from it. I talk to someone immediately. That means I write up an inventory and I call my sponsor. Anyone who ever gets a hold of my big book will be able to see what weird stuff I've been into lately because I have my inventories, my 10-step inventories in the back of my book. I keep extra paper in the front of my book so that I can practice this step 10 throughout my day. If something comes up, a resentment, I find myself being selfish or dishonest or I'm full of fear, I'm able to do an inventory. And then I call my sponsor Joel and I say, this is what's going on in my life. It says we make amends quickly if we've harmed anyone. That means I'm going to go through steps 6 through 9 and repair the damage that I've done. And then finally, I resolutely turn my thoughts to someone I can help. I'm back on the tracks that I needed to be at. Because at this point, the step 10 promises are really beautiful. It talks about how the problem's been removed. That I'm placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. That I'm not even sworn off. That this has come automatically. That I've recovered from this deal. And that's a hot word in Alcoholics Anonymous today. But I'll tell you, the big book uses the word recovered 20 times. And it uses the word recovering once. And it's referring to a guy in the family afterwards who's actively working the 12 steps. Today I stand here as a recovered alcoholic. I'm no longer under a mental obsession that forces me to drink. And I'm no longer under the grip of a phenomenon of craving, continuing the drinking. God has removed that problem. It doesn't mean that I don't have character defects. It doesn't mean that I'm not loony on any given day. But it means the problem, the alcoholism, the hopeless condition of mind and body has been removed. And that's the promise. Why is this such a big deal? Because as a newcomer, what I'd hear in meetings is, I'm just as sick as I ever was, from a guy who's 20 years sober. Or I'm just at arm's length from a drink. Or I'm always going to be recovering. And as a newcomer, I didn't want that. Why on earth would I want to stay in Alcoholics Anonymous if 20 years later I'm just going to be as sick as I ever was? There's no hope in that. And so instead what the big book offers is on our title page. It says, if you open up your big books to the front page, it says Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. That's the hope, that you don't have to live, if you're a newcomer, if you're a guy who's been sitting in these rooms for years and years and years, wondering when the obsession to use is going to be taken away or go away, or maybe you've just resigned yourself to the fact that it's never going away. The hope that Alcoholics Anonymous offers you in the 10-step promises on the title page throughout our big book is that doesn't have to be the case. That I can live in this world free and clear. That I can go where any normal person can go, provided that I remain in fit spiritual condition. There's always a requirement to every set of promises in the big book. But as long as I keep doing the disciplines, the spiritual disciplines of 10, 11, and 12, I am able to go to the most sordid place on earth if that's the way where I'm called to be. I'm able to go to my family's house for Christmas and be around the wine and the Bardstown bourbon and everything, you know. I'm able to do that. I was able for my mother's wedding last month to go and buy a bottle of Chardonnay, whatever. It was some fruity drink that I never would have drank ever. But I was able to buy that, you know. It was funny because it was my first legal drink that I ever bought. I got sober at 19. I'd never bought alcohol legally with an ID before. That was the first time. You know, almost 4 years sober. It was a neat deal. But that's where I'm at step 10. And so what step 10 does is it keeps me on those tracks. What happens is that things distract me. At this point, my attention should always be focused on God. And God is then the one that directs me. Who am I to help? Where am I to go? What am I to do? But occasionally what happens is that a character defect distracts me. And my attention goes from God to this problem or this character defect or that person. And so step 10 reins me back in. It gets me back on the train tracks. Step 11 then is prayer and meditation. And just like the director analogy, if I'm to be a good actor, I need to constantly be in communication with the director. I need to know what cues to take, where to be on stage right, stage left. I need to know what lines to say, what's the emphasis on this line. That's the way I have to structure my life. The big book says that we come to rely upon this thing called prayer and meditation. That in prayer I express my needs, not praying for my selfish ends, but praying how can I be of service? Who can I help? Where can I go? What do I need to do today? And then to quietly listen in meditation. And it says it takes practice. It says it'll work if we have the proper attitude and continue to work at it. And after a while, after I've practiced this deal called meditation, I'll be meditating, I'll ask God, please give me some direction today, and a thought will come out of nowhere. Why don't you call so-and-so? Why don't you go to a wind-up joint and talk to a newcomer? And lo and behold, when I make that call or I go to that place, that's exactly where I needed to be. It wasn't a thought that came from me, it was a thought that came from God. And this is how I'm to live my life. I don't do it perfectly by any means. I can't say that every action I take is directed by God. Certainly not. But the big book says very clearly that this is how I'm to live my life to the best of my ability. And so I try to do that. Step 12 really cannot be explained any better than the way the big book explains it. And so I want to go to a vision for you here. Page 153 in A Vision for You, it talks about Bill Wilson, and he's gone to Akron. It says, years ago in 1935, one of our number, Bill Wilson, made a journey to a certain western city, that was Akron, Ohio. From a business standpoint, his trip came off badly. He had been successful in his enterprise. Had he been successful in his enterprise, he would have been set on his feet financially, which at the time seemed vitally important. But his venture wound up in a lawsuit. In other words, his business deal went to hell. He went down to Akron to deal with Firestone. He had these big dreams of becoming the president one day. And the whole deal went shot through. And now he's stuck in the Mayflower Hotel with $10 in his pocket. And he doesn't know how he's going to pay his bill. He doesn't know how he's going to get back home to New York. He doesn't know what he's going to do. And so he's sitting in the hotel lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. And at one end of the lobby is a bar. And he hears the music and the clanging of glass and the bottles opening up. And he thinks to himself, well, I can go in there and I can have a ginger ale. And maybe I can talk to someone. Maybe they'll be able to help me to go to New York. And then the insanity comes. And then he starts to think, well, maybe I could have a few drinks. Just a few, no more. And he realizes at that moment that he's on thin ice, the big book says. What happens? God gives him sanity. Bill Wilson did not think the drink through. Bill Wilson did not remember the consequences or play this. God clearly gave him sanity at that moment. This nonsense of I can think the drink through. The big book tells me on page 24 that I won't be able to remember the consequences of even a week or a month ago. That's not what happened with Bill. He's in this position. He's worked the 12 steps. He worked them in 9 days with Ebby Thatcher in Towns Hospital in New York that November. It's May now. He's continued to work with others. He's continued to build his relationship with God. The insanity's coming back and God stops it. And at the other end of the lobby, he sees a phone directory. And it's a church directory. Lots of churches. There's about 15 names on there. And he sees it's the church, the pastor's name, and the telephone number. And he goes over there and he starts to think, God gives him the sanity, you need to find another drunk to work with. And he goes over there and the first name he picks is Reverend Walter Tunks. He picked it because Tunks rhymes with drunks. That was the only reason he had to pick it. It was near the last, Walter was the last on the list. That's the one he picked. Walter Tunks happened to be the only Oxford Group minister on that list. And he got him in touch with, of course, Henrietta Seiberling, who got in touch with Dr. Bob. And thus AA was started. Those two alcoholics needing each other, not coming from any spiritual hilltop or anything, but needing each other equally and seeking God together, started Alcoholics Anonymous. We celebrated our 79th birthday June 10th this year. Just a few days, Tuesday of this week. And then what happened? Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, they got sober. And Dr. Bob works all of the 12 steps. Almost. He doesn't make his amends because he's afraid that people are going to find out what he did, and he didn't want to lose his job. He's a doctor. He's a proctologist, in fact. So he doesn't want to lose his career. So he doesn't make his amends. And then one day, it's about June 6th or 7th, he gets an invite annually that he always does to go to the AMA convention in Atlantic City. And he says, Bill, can I go? And Bill says, of course you can go. We're trying to be part of life. And he goes, and he gets drunk because he hasn't repaired the damage. And then he comes back. He gets drunk on the train ride there. He's drunk the entire time, comes back in the middle of the night. Next morning, Bill and Ann Smith, his wife, Bob's wife, wake up and they find Bob drunk. He'd been sober for a little over a month, and they're like, God, what's going to happen? And then to their horror, what they discover is Ann looks at the day planner, and she's like, oh my God, Bob, you've got a surgery today. And he's a proctologist, so he's dealing with people's anuses. And he is shaking. He is detoxing. He is going through it. And so Bill gives him a few beers and says, God be with you. And from the archives, we know that this guy didn't die. He probably whistles while he walks now, but we don't know anything else about him, So, and then Ann and Bill are waiting at the house, and 5 o'clock rolls by, and the surgery should have been done. He should have been home. And 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock, and now it's midnight. He's drunk again. They know that's what happened. But what was he doing? After the surgery, he went out and he made all of his amends that day, and he never had a drink again. That's AA's birthday, June 10th, 1935. He worked all the 12 steps, and that man never had a drink again. And that's the way it worked in early AA, is if I apply myself to the 12 steps, rarely have we seen a person fail. Today, as best we can figure, we have about 5% success rate in AA. Why? Because our meetings have stepped away from the big book. We've stepped away from God, and we've stepped away from the 12 steps. I see it in Louisville all the time. We get guys in treatment centers, and they say, I've tried AA. It doesn't work. And I say, well, what did you mean by you tried AA? I went to a bunch of meetings. I got a sponsor. We talked every once in a while. I went to a whole bunch of meetings, and I got drunk again. Well, did you ever work the steps? No. Did you ever work with others? No. So you never carried the message, nothing like that? No. No, my sponsor said I had to be 2 years sober before I could sponsor. Well, where's that in the big book? Dr. Bob got his first sponsee on June 26, 1935. Bill Dodson from Danville, 16 days sober, was carrying the message. Because what the early AAs recognized and what they believed was what Bill Wilson wrote in his story. He said, if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. Period. If I don't work with others, if I don't help another alcoholic, if I am so selfish that I'm going to sit in the rooms, drink the coffee, talk to the women, and not do anything whatsoever to help the next guy come in, I am sure to get drunk. And if I don't get drunk, I promise you I'll be miserable. Because this thing is like the Dead Sea. If I don't give it away, I will become stagnant. My recovery will become stagnant. And pretty certainly I will drink again. Wrapping this up, this deal of the 12 steps, this was not a message that was presented to me early on. And so that's why I tend to use the podium time a little bit to talk about this, because we're seeing people die. People die with years of sobriety, relapsing, killing themselves, newcomers that can't even get a month sober because the people tell them to wait a year before you work the 12 steps. Or don't use the big book, use this other piece of literature. And people are dying in Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's not what we're about. The hope that Alcoholics Anonymous offers is that you don't have to die of alcoholism on the street. You also don't have to die of alcoholism in the rooms either. That we have a solution. It's outlined in this big book. Get good sponsorship that can carry you through the work in the big book quickly, through the steps, and then go off to help someone. And the promise is that my life, your life, can be pretty freaking amazing if we do this deal. And the blessings that I have in my life today are just, I never would have imagined it. My grandmother, it was my birthday, June 2nd. I turned 23. Go figure. She gave me a birthday card. And she said, "Happy birthday, Benjamin. Unbelievable. As my father used to tell me, you can't be that old." I remember the joy the night you arrived in Louisville. I was adopted. And she says, "I remember the depths of despair when we could not figure out what you needed or how we could help you when I was drinking." And she said, "Well, you figured it out. I like that your solution helps many more than yourself. I wish you a life of purpose and good blessings from a loving God. Love, your Meemaw Pam." And that's what this deal's about. She's got it. That this solution has not only been life transforming for me, it's been for my family, it's been for the guys that I work with in Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, the ripple effect of this deal is amazing. I want to close with this, talking about the 12th step. Whenever I'm at a meeting, I want to stand by the back door. And what I love about this group is there were a lot of you all doing that. Welcoming the newcomer, talking to the newcomer, because that's what this deal is about. And we have to be active in this 12-step work. Dr. Sam Shoemaker was an Oxford group member who really mentored Bill and Bob early on. And he wrote this poem called "I Stand at the Door," and it's really pertinent to my work, your work, and Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I'm going to close with this. He says, "I stand by the door. I neither go too far in nor stay too far out. The door is the most important door in the world. It is the door through which men walk when they find God. There is no use my going way inside and staying there, when so many are still outside, and they, as much as I, crave to know where the door is. And all that so many ever find is only the wall where the door ought to be. They creep along the wall like blind men with outstretched groping hands, feeling for the door, knowing there must be a door, yet they never find it. So I stand by the door. The most tremendous thing in the world is for men to find that door, the door to God. The most important thing that any man can do is to take hold of one of those blind, groping hands and to put it on the latch that only clicks and opens to the man's own touch. Men die outside the door, as starving beggars die, on cold nights in cruel cities in the dead of winter, die for want of what is in their grasp. They live on the other side of it because they have not found it. Nothing else matters compared to helping them find it and open it and walk in and find Him. So I stand by the door. I admire the people who go way in, but I wish they would not forget how it was before they got in. Then they would be able to help the people who have not yet even found the door. You can go in too deeply and stay in too long and forget the people outside the door. As for me, I shall take my old accustomed place, near enough to God to hear Him and to know He is there, but not so far from men as to not hear them. And remember, they are there too. Where? Outside the door. Thousands of them, millions of them. But more important for me and for you, one of them, two of them, 10 of them, whose hands I and you am intended to put on the latch. So I shall stand by the door and wait for those who seek it. I'd rather be a doorkeeper, so I stand by the door.